The sands of Egypt have hidden secrets for thousands of years. For as long as the pyramids have stood, their stories remained locked away, silent and unknowable. A great civilization once ruled here, and yet almost everything about it was a mystery. That is, until July 19th, 1799, when a French soldier during Napoleon's expedition uncovered a single carved stone east of Alexandria. It looked ordinary, but it wasn't. This was the Rosetta Stone, the key to a language that had been dead for over 2,000 years. And with it, the voice of ancient Egypt was finally heard again. But imagine if that stone had never been found. The monuments, the temples, the kings and gods of Egypt, all of it would still be silent. We would gaze at the pyramids in wonder, but never truly understand the people who built them. Their history, their culture, their legacy lost forever. That's why this single discovery matters. It didn't just change history, it saved it. So take a moment, relax, and let's step into the story of how one forgotten stone gave new life to an ancient world. For thousands of years, the Nile River has cut through the heart of Egypt like a silver thread, shaping not only the land, but the destiny of an entire civilization. When we speak of ancient Egypt, it is impossible to separate its story from the river that sustained it. The Nile was not just water, it was life itself, carving fertile valleys out of barren desert and providing the foundation on which one of humanity's earliest great societies would rise. Every year the river followed its rhythm. The floods came, the waters swelled, and when they receded, they left behind a blanket of rich black silt. This soil, renewed annually, gave farmers the chance to cultivate wheat, barley, flax and vegetables in a region that otherwise should have been uninhabitable. Unlike the unpredictable rivers of Mesopotamia, the Nile was steady, almost dependable. And in that stability, communities found security. That rhythm of flood and retreat was so crucial that it became not just an agricultural cycle, but a cultural one. Religion, myths, and even the Egyptian calendar were all tied to the behavior of the river. Long before the pyramids, long before kings wore crowns, the earliest inhabitants of the Nile Valley were hunter-gatherers. In the Paleolithic period, they fashioned tools from stone, bone, and wood, moving with the seasons and relying on fishing and hunting to survive. Evidence from archaeological digs shows the remains of harpoons, grinding stones, and animal bones, silent witnesses to a way of life built around survival. Yet even then, the Nile was central. Its marshes offered fish and birds, its banks provided plants, and its waters became highways for movement. But around 10,000 years ago, something shifted. As the climate changed at the end of the last ice age, the Sahara transformed into a desert, pushing communities closer to the river. Here, necessity became innovation. People began experimenting with planting crops rather than simply gathering them. They learned to store seeds, to manage harvests, and to domesticate animals like cattle, goats, and sheep. This slow revolution, the Neolithic transition, changed everything. For the first time, people were not entirely at the mercy of the seasons. They could produce food, store it, and sustain larger, permanent groups. Settlements began to take root along the Nile. At first, they were simple huts made of reeds and mud, clustered near marshlands and fertile soil. Over time, these small communities grew into villages, bound together by farming, fishing, and trade. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of silos filled with grain, pottery used for storage, and tools designed for cultivation. Each artifact tells the story of a society moving from survival to stability, and from stability to complexity. Geography played a role too. The Nile Valley is a narrow corridor, hemmed in by desert on either side. This created both opportunity and protection. On the one hand, it concentrated communities along the fertile banks, forcing them to interact, trade, and share techniques. On the other, the vast deserts acted as natural barriers, shielding them from many outside threats. While Mesopotamia often faced waves of invaders, Egypt developed in relative isolation, giving its culture time to mature and take shape with a unique identity. It is no coincidence that some of the earliest evidence of organized agriculture and permanent dwellings appears here. Sites like Merimde and the Fayum Basin reveal not just tools and food remains, but also traces of social life, hearths, workshops, and burial grounds. The care given to the dead, even at this early stage, suggests that spiritual beliefs were already forming, perhaps linked to the cycles of life and death observed so vividly in the Nile's yearly floods. As centuries passed, techniques grew more sophisticated. Irrigation systems appeared, with channels and basins dug to control the flow of water and extend farmland further from the riverbank. Farmers learned to predict the floods and plant accordingly, a skill that demanded cooperation and planning. In many ways, the seeds of later Egyptian administration and bureaucracy were already being planted in these early irrigation projects, where collective effort determined survival. The landscape itself reinforced this unity. The Nile runs from south to north, emptying into the Mediterranean. But for those who lived along its course, the river was both a road and a lifeline. Boats carried goods, ideas, and people up and down its waters. Fishing communities in the delta exchanged with herders in the south. Stone from quarries, timber from imported trade, and food from distant fields all moved along the same current. What began as scattered tribes slowly transformed into connected societies, bound together by the artery of the river. The rhythm of life along the Nile also left marks on the imagination. The floods that brought life could also bring destruction, if too high or too low. It is easy to see how the river became woven into religion, seen as both a blessing and a divine power. Later myths of gods controlling fertility, water, and renewal almost certainly trace their roots back to these early days, when people first struggled to understand the forces that controlled their survival. By the time the Neolithic gave way to the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, the Nile Valley was no longer just a home for scattered settlements. It was a cradle of civilization. Agriculture had created surplus, surplus had allowed specialization, and specialization had given rise to hierarchy. Leaders emerged, communities organized, and cultural traditions solidified. Pottery, art, and early symbols of writing appear in the archaeological record, suggesting not only practical needs, but also the beginnings of identity. It is striking to realize how much of Egypt's later greatness had its foundations here. The monumental temples, the careful calendars, the complex religious systems, all of them grew out of the simple fact that the Nile flooded and people learned to adapt to it. The story of ancient Egypt does not begin with kings or pyramids. It begins with water, soil, and the determination of early people to make a life in the narrow strip of land between desert and river. Even today, when one looks at satellite images of Egypt, the contrast is sharp. A green ribbon of life winds through endless sand, just as it did thousands of years ago. That ribbon was the stage on which one of humanity's most enduring civilizations first appeared. And it all started with the annual gift of the Nile, a rhythm of nature that became the heartbeat of Egypt's history. Before the first pharaoh wore a crown, before the pyramids rose above the desert sands, Egypt was a land of scattered tribes and small settlements clinging to the banks of the Nile. These early people left no written records, no grand monuments, only traces in the soil and fragments in the sand. Yet from these fragments, a remarkable story emerges. The story of how one of the world's greatest civilizations began. Archaeologists today uncover shards of pottery, simple tools, and ancient graves that reveal a society slowly changing. What began as bands of hunters and gatherers gradually transformed into organized communities. They learned to cultivate the land, to store food, and to live side by side in permanent villages. Over centuries, those small steps grew into something greater: the first cities, the first rulers, and eventually the birth of kingship itself. This was the prelude to ancient Egypt's long history, an age when cultures rose, merged, and competed along the Nile, setting the stage for the unification of a kingdom that would endure for millennia. Far back in time, long before Egypt's first kings, life along the Nile was shaped by small farming communities. One of the earliest was the culture of the Fayum, settled around a great lake southwest of the Giza Plateau. Here, people built simple reed houses, sometimes with underground storage pits where food could be kept safe. They domesticated cattle, goats and sheep, while relying on fishing and hunting to fill out their diet. Archaeologists have uncovered baskets, pottery, and tools that show a society both resourceful and adaptive, learning to use every part of its environment. To the north, near the western edge of the Nile Delta, another culture emerged at Merimde. Dating back to the 6th millennium BCE, it was one of the first truly permanent farming settlements in Egypt. The people of Merimde cultivated wheat and barley, kept herds, and crafted pottery with distinctive decoration. Evidence of small homes clustered together suggests a stable community, one that could support families generation after generation. Their burial practices were simple, but they already hint at the beginnings of ritual and belief that would later define Egyptian culture. These early cultures, though modest, marked the first steps from survival to stability. They laid the foundation for everything that followed, showing how life along the Nile could be more than temporary. It could endure. As centuries passed, the people of the Nile began to build on those first experiments in farming and settlement. In southern Egypt, around 4400 BCE, a new culture took shape that archaeologists call the Badarian. Unlike the earlier groups of Fayum or Merimde, the Badarian left behind clearer signs of social structure and ritual. Their communities were still modest, made up of small huts and simple fields, but their graves tell us something important had changed. Burials from the Badarian period include carefully placed bodies, often laid on their left side, facing west, the direction of the setting sun. Beside them, archaeologists found pottery, tools, and even ornaments made from ivory and precious stones. These were not random objects. They were chosen gifts for the afterlife, a sign that people were beginning to believe in a world beyond death. With these burials, we see the earliest hints of the spiritual traditions that would later dominate Egyptian thought. The pottery of the Badarian was finely made, decorated with rippled surfaces that suggest both skill and aesthetic sensibility. Some graves contained more goods than others, revealing the beginnings of inequality. For the first time, status and wealth were recorded in death as well as in life. Here in these early cemeteries lies the first glimpse of hierarchy, the seed of the social order that would eventually grow into monarchy. The Badarian culture, though small in scale, represents a turning point. It was more than survival and farming. It was the first spark of the values that would shape Egypt: reverence for the afterlife, appreciation of artistry, and recognition of power. By the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, a series of cultures along the Nile began to expand in both scale and complexity. Collectively known today as the Naqada cultures, they show us how small farming communities grew into organized societies that looked increasingly like the Egypt we recognize. The first of these, the Amratian or Naqada culture, around 4000 BCE, introduced new forms of settlement. People built sturdier houses with wattle and daub walls, and their pottery displayed distinctive red and black patterns. In some graves, archaeologists have found early attempts at body preservation, suggesting that the concept of mummification may trace its roots back to this period. Trade extended further afield, with materials like obsidian and shells appearing in the Nile Valley, carried from distant lands. By 3500 BCE, the Gurzian or Naqada II culture had taken shape. This was a society reaching outward. Long-distance trade networks connected Egypt with Nubia to the south, the Levant to the east, and perhaps even Mesopotamia. Egyptian artisans began to experiment with new motifs in art. Boats, animals, and figures that reflect a growing symbolic language. Houses grew more elaborate, some with courtyards and storage rooms. At Abydos, large burial grounds became the center of ritual life, with tombs built more substantially than ever before. The scale of these cemeteries points to the rise of local elites, whose wealth and influence were beginning to set them apart. Finally, around 3200 BCE, the Naqada III period, often called the Proto-Dynastic, marked the threshold of true kingship. It is here that we find the first large tombs, decorated ceremonial palettes, and the earliest hieroglyphic symbols carved on pottery and seal impressions. The famous Nama palette, with its scenes of conquest and unification, belongs to this tradition. The imagery shows rulers not simply as leaders of tribes, but as figures of authority, almost larger than life. Taken together, the Naqada cultures reveal a dramatic transformation. Within a few centuries, the Nile Valley evolved from scattered villages into a landscape of competing centers, each with its own leaders, its own symbols, and its own ambitions. The stage was set for rivalry, for consolidation, and for the birth of Egypt's first kings. As the Naqada cultures flourished, their villages expanded into powerful centers that can rightly be called Egypt's first city-states. Scattered along the Nile, places like Nekhen, also known as Hierakonpolis, Naqada, and Thinis began to dominate their regions. Each settlement was more than just a cluster of homes. They were hubs of trade, religion, and authority, where emerging elites could project their influence. Nekhen, in particular, grew into one of the most significant. Archaeologists have uncovered vast cemeteries, large houses, and even early temples dedicated to Horus, the falcon god, who would later become one of the most important deities in all of Egypt. Here, the rulers of Nekhen displayed their wealth in elaborate burials stocked with goods from across the Nile Valley and beyond. This was not just prosperity, it was a statement of power, carefully displayed for all to see. Competition between these city-states was inevitable. Control of fertile land, access to trade routes, and dominance of religious centers all became sources of rivalry. Warfare, once small and local, began to take on a larger scale. Some of the most striking evidence comes from ceremonial mace heads and palettes that depict leaders towering above their enemies, symbols of victory carved into stone. These images are not only records of battle, they are propaganda, the first signs of rulers presenting themselves as something more than human. In this age of growing rivalry, leadership evolved from chieftains into proto-kings. Authority was no longer just about managing a village or leading a raid. It was about commanding loyalty, organizing resources, and projecting an image of divine favor. The competition between city-states was fierce, but it was also the crucible in which Egyptian kingship was forged. Out of these struggles would come unity, and the birth of the pharaoh. Amid the rise of city-states and their rivalries, another development quietly transformed Egypt forever: the invention of writing. The earliest signs appear in the late Naqada period, around 3300 BCE. At first, they were simple marks scratched onto pottery and clay ceilings, symbols used to track goods and ownership. But very quickly, these marks evolved into something far greater. These early symbols were not random. They represented ideas, sounds, and objects, combining into a system that could record information with precision. This system would become the hieroglyphic script, one of the most iconic achievements of Egyptian civilization. From the start, writing was bound to power. Seal impressions on jars and tomb goods show that record-keeping was essential for managing resources, trade, and religious offerings. To control writing was to control authority. What is remarkable is how fully formed this system appears, even in its earliest examples. The signs are carefully drawn, with a sense of artistry as well as function. They were not just practical records, but symbols of prestige. Only a small elite, likely associated with temples and rulers, could read and write them. Writing was not meant for everyone. It was a tool of administration, but also of ritual, linking the earthly and the divine. From these first scratchings, hieroglyphs would grow into one of the most complex scripts of the ancient world. They could record history, describe religious rituals, and immortalize kings. Without this invention, Egypt's voice would have been lost to time, its monuments reduced to silent stone. Instead, hieroglyphs ensured that Egypt's story would endure, etched into walls and carved into eternity. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, Egypt was no longer a land of scattered tribes. The city-states of Upper and Lower Egypt had grown, powerful, and their rivalry reached a breaking point. Out of this struggle emerged one of the most important figures in history, a ruler remembered as Narmer. The story of Narmer's unification is preserved most vividly on a carved ceremonial palette discovered at Hierakonpolis. On one side, Narmer wears the tall white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down an enemy. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, leading a procession of triumph. The message is clear. Two lands, once divided, brought together under a single king. This was more than just a military conquest. It was a symbolic act of creation, the birth of Egypt as a unified kingdom. Archaeological evidence suggests that this unification was not achieved in a single battle, but through years of conflict, alliances, and political marriages. Narmer himself may have sealed his rule by marrying Neithhotep, a princess of Lower Egypt, strengthening his claim over both regions. With unification came new traditions. Kings adopted the double crown, combining red and white as a permanent emblem of their authority. They also took on titles that proclaimed them rulers of the two lands, protectors of Upper and Lower Egypt alike. The importance of Narmer's achievement cannot be overstated. For the first time, the Nile Valley was under one central authority. Resources could be organized, laws could be enforced, and monumental projects could be planned on a scale never before possible. Egypt was now set on a path that would lead to the age of the pharaohs, and eventually the building of the Great Pyramids. The unification under Narmer was not just the beginning of a dynasty, it was the beginning of Egypt itself, a single nation, bound together by the river, by culture, and by the vision of its first king. With Narmer's unification, Egypt entered a new era, the early dynastic period. Spanning roughly from 3100 to 2700 BCE, this was the age when kingship took its full shape, when traditions of rule, religion, and administration began to crystallize. The great civilization that later built pyramids and temples was still young, but its foundations were already being laid. Narmer's successors, beginning with King Aha, established their authority over both Upper and Lower Egypt. One of their most important decisions was the creation of a new capital, Memphis, located near the apex of the Nile Delta. Strategically placed, Memphis gave rulers access to both halves of their kingdom and allowed them to control trade routes stretching in every direction. From this seat of power, the kings could oversee the first centralized state in history. Royal tombs at Abydos reveal much about these early rulers. Constructed of mud brick, they were large and increasingly elaborate, with chambers for offerings and goods. The contents of these tombs, tools, vessels, ornaments, and even sacrificed retainers in some cases, show the growing wealth of the monarchy and the belief that the king required servants and supplies in the afterlife. These practices set the tone for Egypt's long tradition of monumental burial. Among the kings of the first dynasty, Den stands out. His reign lasted for decades, and he is remembered for both military campaigns and administrative reforms. He was also the first ruler shown wearing both the red and white crowns together, symbolizing his sovereignty over the unified land. Another figure of note is Queen Mernith, who may have acted as regent for her young son, making her one of the earliest women in recorded history to wield royal authority. The Second Dynasty continued the process of strengthening the state, though it was marked by internal rivalries. Some rulers, such as Peribsen, associated themselves with the god Seth rather than Horus, a striking departure from tradition. This may reflect political divisions within the kingdom. Yet by the end of the period, King Kasekemwi reunited the land and restored stability, blending the symbols of Horus and Seth on his monuments, a powerful image of reconciliation. Through these first two dynasties, kingship became more than leadership. The pharaoh was no longer just a warrior or administrator. He was the embodiment of divine order, chosen by the gods to maintain harmony, what the Egyptians called Ma'at. The idea of divine kingship, born in this period, would endure for over 3,000 years. By the close of the early dynastic period, the role of Egypt's ruler had evolved into something far greater than mere political leadership. The king was no longer seen simply as a chief or a unifier of lands. He had become a divine figure, the living embodiment of order itself. This was the birth of divine kingship, an idea that would define Egyptian civilization for millennia. The Egyptians believed the pharaoh was chosen by the gods, and in some sense was himself a god in human form. His duty was to uphold Ma'at, the principle of balance, truth, and harmony that governed the universe. When the Nile flooded predictably, when crops grew, and when peace prevailed, it was seen as proof that the king was fulfilling his sacred role. When chaos or famine struck, the responsibility was his as well. Symbols reinforced this divine authority. The pharaoh carried the crook and flail, representing care and discipline. He wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, showing that he ruled not just land, but cosmic unity. Ceremonies, rituals, and temple offerings all revolved around his presence. Even the earliest stone monuments and inscriptions portrayed the king as larger than his subjects, dominating enemies and standing closest to the gods. This transformation of kingship shaped everything that followed. It gave Egypt a stable ideology: one king, one land, one divine order. It also created a sense of continuity. Each ruler was not just an individual, but a link in an eternal chain, entrusted with maintaining harmony between humanity and the divine. Kingship was more than politics, it was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. And it was this belief, forged in the early dynastic period, that set the stage for the next great chapter, the rise of the Old Kingdom and the dream of eternity in stone. From the first reed huts of the Fayum to the great tombs of Abydos, Egypt's journey through the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods was nothing short of remarkable. In only a few millennia, scattered tribes of farmers and herders became a unified kingdom, bound together by the Nile and governed by kings who claimed divine authority. Cultures like Merimde, Badarian, and Nakada laid the groundwork with farming, trade, and artistry. Nama's unification gave the land its first pharaoh, and the early dynasties cemented the idea that Egypt was more than a collection of villages. It was a single, enduring civilization. The achievements of this age were not measured in pyramids or temples, but in foundations: agriculture, Writing, kingship, and religion all took root here. These were the cornerstones that allowed Egypt to grow into one of history's greatest powers. By the end of the Second Dynasty, the system of divine kingship was firmly in place. Memphis stood as the kingdom's capital, and Egypt was ready for its next leap forward. That leap would define the world's image of ancient Egypt. The Old Kingdom was about to begin, an era when kings dreamed of eternity and stone rose from the desert to touch the sky. Let's talk about the moment when Egypt first began to dream of eternity. The early dynastic kings had unified the land and established their power, but it was in the Old Kingdom that their ambitions turned to stone. This was the age when Egypt's rulers sought to leave monuments that would outlast their own lifetimes. The monuments that still stand today, thousands of years later. The Old Kingdom is remembered as the Age of Pyramids, and it all began with one king and one visionary architect. Around 2650 BCE, King Djoser of the Third Dynasty ordered the construction of a tomb unlike any before it. For generations, rulers had been buried in mastabas, flat-roofed rectangular structures of mud brick. Djoser wanted something more, something that would proclaim his divine power not only in life, but in death. His architect, a man named Imhotep, had the solution. Imhotep was no ordinary builder. He was a priest, a physician, and an innovator whose ideas would change the course of Egyptian architecture. Instead of mud brick, he used stone, a material that promised permanence, and instead of a single mastaba, he envisioned a series, stacked one on top of another, rising step by step into the sky. The result was the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the first monumental stone structure in history. Standing over 60 meters tall, the Step Pyramid was more than a tomb. It was an entire complex, surrounded by courtyards, temples, and shrines, all enclosed within a massive stone wall. Here, rituals would be performed to honor the king, ensuring his eternal life among the gods. Every element reflected a belief that the pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a divine being, whose afterlife needed to be sustained by ceremony and structure. The design was revolutionary. Until then, stone had been used sparingly, for small objects or limited structures. Imhotep's decision to build entirely in stone created a new standard. Walls were carved to resemble reeds, doors, and wooden beams, imitating familiar materials, but in a form that would never decay. It was as if Egypt's architects were saying, "We will preserve not just the body of the king, but the very image of his world." Archaeologists who study the Saqqara complex find more than engineering genius. They find evidence of a new way of thinking. This was not architecture for the living, it was architecture for eternity. The Step Pyramid proclaimed that the king's power stretched beyond his mortal life, that he was destined to ascend to the heavens. In this way, stone became both a political statement and a spiritual promise. Imhotep himself was remembered long after his lifetime. Centuries later, he was deified as a god of wisdom and healing, his reputation surviving alongside the monument he designed. And though later pyramids would surpass Djoser's in size and refinement, none would ever match the Step Pyramid in innovation. It marked the beginning of a tradition that would come to define Egypt's Old Kingdom, the building of pyramids as eternal stairways for divine kings. After Djoser's Step Pyramid set the stage, the Old Kingdom moved into a new chapter under a king whose ambition pushed architecture to its limits. His name was Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, and history remembers him as the true innovator of the Pyramid Age. Sneferu was not content with a single monument. He commissioned at least 3 major pyramids, each one a bold experiment. The first was at Meidum, begun as a step structure, but later transformed into a smooth-sided pyramid. That change, however, proved unstable. Much of the outer casing collapsed in antiquity, leaving behind what looks today like a massive tower surrounded by rubble. To later Egyptians, it was known as the false pyramid, a reminder of both ambition and failure. Undeterred, Sneferu turned to Dashur, where his builders attempted another design. This time, the pyramid began at a steep angle, rising quickly. But structural problems soon became obvious. To save the monument from collapse, the architects adjusted midway, reducing the angle of the upper section. The result is the bent pyramid, its sides breaking at a visible slope. Though unusual in appearance, it still stands as a testament to ingenuity under pressure. Sneferu's third attempt, the Red Pyramid at Dashur, finally achieved perfection. Built with a stable foundation and a consistent angle, it rose over 100 meters into the sky, becoming the first true smooth-sided pyramid in Egypt. Its reddish limestone casing gave it the name it carries today, but its real legacy was architectural mastery. The lessons learned at Meidum and Dashur had paid off. Through these experiments, Sneferu transformed the pyramid from a stepped monument into the iconic form that would forever define ancient Egypt. His projects demanded immense resources, quarries of stone, thousands of workers, and an organized system to feed, house, and direct them. Yet his reign was remembered not for hardship, but for stability and prosperity. The pyramids were symbols of power, but they were also the outcome of a kingdom united and efficient. Sneferu's vision set the standard for his successors. By the time he died, Egypt had not only perfected the art of pyramid construction, it had entered its golden age. And his son, Khufu, would take that legacy to unprecedented heights. Now let's talk about the most famous monument of them all, the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza. If Sneferu was the experimenter, Khufu was the one who took those lessons and created a wonder that has endured for over 4,500 years. Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, came to the throne around 2580 BCE. Determined to surpass his father's achievements, he ordered the construction of a pyramid on a scale never before attempted. Rising to a height of nearly 150 meters, the Great Pyramid remained the tallest man-made structure on Earth for more than 3,800 years. The precision of its construction continues to astonish. Each block of limestone, weighing several tons, was cut and transported with methods still debated today. The base of the pyramid covers over 13 acres, and yet its sides are aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal points of the compass. Inside, a network of passages and chambers reflects not only engineering skill, but also a complex vision of the afterlife. This monumental project did not rest on slave labor, as often imagined. Archaeological evidence shows that skilled workers and seasonal farmers formed the workforce, organized in rotating teams. During the annual Nile inundation, when fields were underwater, thousands contributed their labor to the king's eternal resting place. They were housed in nearby workers' villages, provided with food, beer, and medical care. Building the pyramid was not only a duty, it was a collective expression of loyalty to the pharaoh. At the center of this vast operation was Khufu's vizier, Hemyunu, believed to be the chief architect. His tomb near the pyramid marks his high status and his role in directing what was arguably the greatest construction project of the ancient world. The Great Pyramid was more than a tomb. To the Egyptians, it was a cosmic symbol, a staircase to the heavens, ensuring Khufu's soul would ascend to join the gods. Its sheer size projected the might of the pharaoh, visible from miles across the desert. Even today, standing at its base, one feels the intended message, the power of a king who sought to be remembered for eternity. After Khufu's reign, the next great chapter at Giza belonged to his successors, Khafra and Menkaure. And with them came not only more pyramids, but one of the most iconic monuments in all of Egypt. The great Sphinx Khafre, Khufu's son, built the second pyramid on the Giza plateau. Though slightly smaller than his father's, it was raised on higher ground, giving it an imposing profile. His pyramid complex also included a valley temple, paved with massive stone blocks, where rituals for the dead king were performed. Standing beside this complex is the Great Sphinx, carved directly from the bedrock. With the body of a lion and the head of a king, the Sphinx has long been associated with Khafre, though some argue it may even represent Khufu. Either way, its purpose was clear: to guard the necropolis, a silent sentinel watching over the pyramids. The Sphinx embodies both mystery and power. Its weathered face still carries traces of the pharaoh's features, while its massive form reflects the Egyptian belief in guardianship and divine kingship. For thousands of years, it has drawn wonder, debate, and legend, from ancient priests to modern travelers. Menkaure, Khafre's successor, built the third pyramid at Giza. Smaller in scale, it reflected a shift in resources and priorities, but it was no less significant in symbolism. Menkaure's pyramid was originally clad in granite at its base, giving it a distinctive appearance. Despite its size, it continued the tradition of linking royal power with eternal monuments. Together, the pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure formed a grand statement, a royal family's claim to immortality carved into stone. Alongside them, the Great Sphinx stood as both protector and enigma, tying the human ruler to the cosmic order. The Giza Plateau, by the end of the Fourth Dynasty, was not just a burial ground. It was a city of eternity, a landscape where kings declared their divine right to rule, not only in life, but forever. Now that we've seen the pyramids rising on the desert plateau, let's step back for a moment and talk about the people who lived in their shadow. Because behind every monument, there was an entire society at work, a carefully structured world that kept Egypt's old kingdom running. At the very top stood the pharaoh, the divine king, believed to be chosen by the gods themselves. Beneath him was the vizier, often a trusted family member who acted as the chief administrator, overseeing everything from construction projects to taxation. The priesthood formed another powerful class, conducting rituals and managing the wealth of the temples. Scribes, trained in the art of writing, were the lifeblood of the bureaucracy. They recorded harvests, counted laborers, and kept track of offerings, ensuring that the machinery of the state never faltered. But the real backbone of Egypt was its farmers. Living in simple mud brick houses along the fertile banks of the Nile, they grew wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. When the river flooded each year, covering the fields, farming came to a pause. This was the time when thousands joined the great projects of the state, quarrying stone, transporting blocks, and raising pyramids. They were not slaves, but citizens fulfilling a duty, rewarded with food, beer, and sometimes a chance at upward mobility through skilled work. Daily life revolved around family, food, and labor. Bread and beer were staples, supplemented by fish, onions, and fruits. Men tilled the fields or worked on state projects, while women tended gardens, brewed beer, and cared for children. Craftsmen, potters, and carpenters added color to society, producing the goods needed for both daily life and ritual. In this balance of hierarchy and community, Egypt thrived. The Old Kingdom was not only an age of kings and monuments, but also of ordinary lives woven into a system that made greatness possible. Let's take a closer look at how Egypt actually managed to build all of this, because behind the grand pyramids and temples, there was something just as important: the machinery of administration. Without it, the Old Kingdom could never have functioned. At the center of this system stood the vizier, often described as the prime minister of the pharaoh. The vizier supervised tax collection, justice, building projects, and even the storage of grain. Every report flowed through him, and every decision was carried out in the king's name. Supporting him was a network of scribes. These men, trained from childhood to master hieroglyphs, recorded harvests, managed accounts, and documented royal decrees. To be a scribe was to hold real power, because in Egypt, writing meant authority. The temples formed another pillar of administration. Far from being just places of worship, they were economic hubs, storing grain, managing land, and distributing wealth. Priests directed offerings and ensured that rituals were performed, linking the prosperity of the state to the favor of the gods. This system was remarkably efficient. Taxes were collected in grain and goods, redistributed to workers and officials, and recorded with precision. Through this bureaucracy, Egypt could feed its people, organize massive labor forces, and direct resources to projects like the Great Pyramid. In the Old Kingdom, power was not only about the pharaoh's divine image, it was about the ability to coordinate thousands of lives, binding them together in service of eternity. Now that we've seen how Egypt was governed, let's turn to something that shaped every part of Old Kingdom life: art, religion, and the belief in the afterlife. Because in Egypt, daily life and eternal life were always connected. Old Kingdom art is instantly recognizable. Statues and reliefs were created in a precise, orderly style. Figures stand tall and rigid, faces calm, proportions carefully measured. This wasn't about capturing individuality. It was about expressing ideals, strength, stability, and eternal perfection. For the Egyptians, art was not decoration. It was a tool of eternity, designed to preserve the essence of a person forever. Religion guided this vision. The Egyptians believed that each person had a ka, a spiritual double, and a biar, a soul that could move between worlds. To survive after death, the ka needed nourishment, food, drink, and offerings placed in the tomb. The pharaoh, seen as a god on earth, was guaranteed eternal life, but ordinary people also hoped to join him in the afterworld. This belief gave rise to the earliest sacred writings, known as the pyramid texts, first inscribed inside the tomb of King Unas at the end of the 5th dynasty. These spells and prayers guided the king's soul through the dangers of the afterlife, ensuring his safe passage to the gods. Art, ritual, and writing were all woven together with one purpose: to make life eternal. And in the Old Kingdom, that belief gave shape to stone, carving immortality into the desert. Every great age eventually reaches its limits, and the Old Kingdom was no exception. After centuries of stability and monumental achievement, cracks began to appear in the system that had held Egypt together. Let's talk about how this golden age unraveled. By the 6th dynasty, the resources that once fueled the pyramids were stretched thin. Monumental projects demanded enormous labor and wealth, and over time, the state struggled to sustain them. The pyramid of King Pepi II, who ruled for an astonishing 90 years, was far smaller and less impressive than those of earlier kings, a symbol of declining power and dwindling resources. Another problem was decentralization. Egypt had always depended on its provincial governors, known as nomarchs, to manage local affairs. During the Old Kingdom's peak, these officials answered directly to the pharaoh. But as central authority weakened, the nomarchs began to act independently, building lavish tombs and accumulating wealth of their own. Power that once flowed to Memphis now became scattered across the provinces. Religion also played a part. The priesthood of Ra, the sun god, grew increasingly influential, managing vast temple estates and drawing resources away from the monarchy. Over time, the king's divine status, once the cornerstone of Egyptian unity, was rivaled by the wealth and authority of priests and regional elites. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the system had fractured. The long reign of Pepi II left no strong successor, and Egypt entered what historians call the First Intermediate Period. It was a time of division when local rulers competed for power and central authority virtually disappeared. The Great Pyramids still stood on the Giza Plateau, but the unity that had built them was gone. The Old Kingdom had shown Egypt's capacity for greatness, yet its decline revealed how fragile even the mightiest system could be when balance was lost. So as the Old Kingdom drew to a close, Egypt stood at a crossroads. The pyramids of Giza and Saqqara still dominated the landscape, reminders of a time when kings commanded unmatched authority and resources. But beneath that grandeur, the system had begun to collapse. Local governors held more power than the pharaoh, priests controlled vast wealth, and the central government could no longer sustain the same level of ambition. This was the paradox of the Old Kingdom. It had created monuments meant to last forever, yet the society that built them could not maintain its own stability. With the death of Pepi II and the absence of strong leadership, Egypt slipped into an era of political fragmentation. Historians call it the First Intermediate Period, a time when the Nile Valley was divided among rival powers and the once unshakable image of the pharaoh seemed to fade. But Egypt's story was far from over. Out of this age of decentralization and uncertainty would come renewal, as new dynasties rose to restore unity. The Old Kingdom had ended, but its legacy, the pyramids, the idea of divine kingship and the dream of eternity, would shape every era that followed. Let's talk about what happened when Egypt's first golden age came to an end. The pyramids still towered over the desert, eternal symbols of power, but the system that had built them was crumbling. The Old Kingdom had thrived on strong kings, centralized rule, and the wealth of the Nile. But by the time the Sixth Dynasty faded, all of that stability began to unravel. Egypt was about to enter a time of weakness, rivalry, and uncertainty, a period that historians now call the First Intermediate Period. The roots of this collapse can be traced to the long reign of King Pepi II. He ruled for nearly 90 years, the longest in Egyptian history, but longevity came with a cost. By the end of his reign, Pepi was an aging monarch with little ability to maintain the balance of power. His successors were weak, and central authority slipped away. Without a strong hand at the top, Egypt's political system began to fracture. The Nile still flooded, the fields were still fertile, but the state that organized those resources was no longer unified. Provincial governors, known as nomarchs, had always played an important role in managing local affairs. Now, without an effective king to control them, they became powers in their own right. Some built tombs as large and elaborate as those of the pharaohs, others commanded their own militias and collected taxes independently. The very officials, who once served the crown, were now acting like kings in miniature. The priesthood, too, grew stronger. Temples controlled large estates and managed wealth that once flowed to the palace. Priests of the sun god Ra, in particular, expanded their influence, challenging the monarchy's traditional role as the sole bridge between humans and the divine. In this shifting landscape, loyalty to the pharaoh was no longer certain. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of both struggle and adaptation. In some regions, local rulers flourished, leaving behind impressive tombs filled with goods. In others, inscriptions speak of hardship, famine, and disorder. Whether Egypt truly descended into chaos across the entire land is debated, but one thing is clear: the central government had lost its grip. What followed was a political vacuum. Dynasties in Memphis claimed the throne, but their authority barely extended beyond the capital. Rival powers rose in Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt, while Thebes in the south began to assert itself as a challenger. Egypt was no longer one kingdom. Under a single ruler, it was a patchwork of competing states, each fighting for control of the Nile Valley. The First Intermediate Period had begun, and though it lacked the monuments and glory of the Old Kingdom, it set the stage for one of the most dramatic resurgences in Egyptian history. Out of this age of division, a new power would rise from Thebes, determined to reunite the land and restore Egypt's greatness. So what exactly did Egypt look like after the fall of the Old Kingdom? Instead of one king ruling from Memphis, the land was divided among rival powers, each claiming to be the true heir of the throne. This is where the drama of the first intermediate period really begins. In the north, around Memphis, short-lived dynasties known as the 7th and 8th tried to keep the old system alive. But their authority was weak. Some kings are barely more than names on king lists, their reigns lasting months or just a few years. They were pharaohs in title, but not in power. Further south in Middle Egypt, the city of Heracleopolis emerged as a center of strength. Its rulers, who historians count as the 9th and 10th dynasties, established control over the central Nile Valley. They styled themselves as legitimate kings, building their own courts and armies, but their influence did not extend far enough to unite the country. Instead, their power clashed with another rising force in the south. That force was Thebes. Once a provincial town in Upper Egypt, Thebes grew under the leadership of a family of nomarchs who were determined to challenge Heracleopolitan rule. By adopting royal titles and building their own monuments, they made it clear that they were, more than local governors, they saw themselves as true kings. For decades, Egypt existed as a battleground of claims. Memphis had its shadow dynasties, Heracleopolis claimed the middle, and Thebes pressed from the south. Each court issued decrees, conducted rituals, and tried to present itself as the legitimate center of Egypt. But the reality was division. A fragmented kingdom where alliances shifted, resources were drained, and war was never far away. This rivalry could not last forever. Eventually, one side would rise above the others, and it would not be the rulers of Memphis or Heracleopolis. It would be Thebes. Now let's shift our focus south to Thebes, the city that would eventually pull Egypt back together. In the beginning, Thebes was just one of many provincial centers, ruled by local nomarchs, like countless others along the Nile. But in the vacuum of the first intermediate period, Theban leaders began to carve out a larger role for themselves. First of these was Intef I, who around 2125 BCE took the bold step of claiming not just regional authority, but royal titles. He styled himself Great Overlord of the South and positioned Thebes as more than a provincial capital. His successors, Intef II and Intef III, expanded this vision. They extended Theban control northward, capturing key nomes and establishing a rival court that openly defied the Heracleopolitan kings. What set the Theban rulers apart was not just military strength, but also cultural ambition. They began commissioning temples and monuments that echoed the traditions of the Old Kingdom, signaling their claim to legitimacy. At Abydos and Thebes, inscriptions from this time reflect a growing confidence, portraying the Theban line not as rebels, but as rightful rulers destined to unify the land. This was more than politics. It was identity. The Thebans tapped into Egypt's deep cultural memory, presenting themselves as restorers of order, the principle of Ma'at, against the chaos of division. Their growing power was both practical and symbolic, and each generation carried the struggle further. By the time of the later Intefs, Thebes was no longer a regional power. It was a kingdom in its own right, strong enough to challenge Heracleopolis directly. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation, and one Theban ruler, Mentuhotep II, would finally bring Egypt back under a single crown. Now we come to the ruler who ended the centuries of division and restored Egypt's unity. Mentuhotep, II of Thebes. If Nama was remembered as the first unifier, then Mentuhotep earned the title of the second unifier, the king who brought the land back together after the long shadows of the first intermediate period. Mentuhotep II came to power in the 11th dynasty, inheriting the growing strength that his Intef predecessors had built. At first, his rule was limited to Upper Egypt. but he had a clear vision to claim authority over the entire Nile Valley. For decades, he pressed against the Heracleopolitan kings, waging campaigns that were as much about legitimacy as territory. Each victory was not only military, but symbolic, proof that Thebes carried the mandate to rule. The decisive moment came when Mentuhotep II defeated the rulers of Heracleopolis. With this victory, he was able to proclaim himself the sole king of Egypt. After more than a century of division, the two lands were once again united. The reunification was not just political, it was spiritual. Mentuhotep presented himself as the embodiment of order restored, the champion of Ma'at against the chaos that had plagued the country. He celebrated this triumph with one of the most remarkable monuments of the age, his mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari near modern Luxor. Unlike the step pyramids or the massive tombs of the Old Kingdom, this complex combined architecture and landscape in a new way. Terraces, colonnades, and chapels rose against the cliffs of western Thebes, creating a harmonious design that would later inspire temples for centuries to come. Mentuhotep II's reign marked the dawn of the Middle Kingdom, an age often called Egypt's classical period. His success restored centralized rule, stabilized the country, and re-established the image of the pharaoh as a divine unifier. From Thebes, Egypt looked forward to a new era, one built not just on memory of the pyramids, but on a renewed vision of power, culture, and prosperity. With Egypt reunited under Mentuhotep II, stability returned, but the work of rebuilding a strong state was far from over. That task fell to a new dynasty, the 12th, founded by a ruler named Amenemhat I. His reign would shape the Middle Kingdom into one of Egypt's most enduring ages of prosperity. Amenemhat I began his rule around 1991 BCE. Unlike earlier kings from powerful families, Amenemhat had risen from the ranks of officials, serving as vizier before seizing the throne. His background gave him a sharp understanding of how fragile central authority could be, and he acted decisively to strengthen it. One of his first moves was to shift the capital north from Thebes to a new city called Ichtawi, strategically placed near Memphis and the Fayum region. This location allowed him to keep a close eye on both Upper and Lower Egypt, balancing the two halves of the kingdom. He also curbed the independence of the nomarchs, who had gained enormous influence during the first intermediate period. Instead of allowing governors to build dynasties of their own, Amenemhat installed officials loyal to him and rotated posts to prevent local power from growing too strong. It was a calculated effort to make sure no region could challenge the crown again. Amenemhat also understood the power of ideas. He promoted texts like the Prophecy of Neferti, which described a land torn apart by chaos, until a savior king, clearly modeled after Amenemhat, restored order. This was more than literature, it was propaganda, crafted to legitimize his rule and remind people that stability was only possible under a strong pharaoh. To secure the future, Amenemhat introduced the system of co-regency, making his son Senusret a king alongside him during his lifetime. This innovation ensured smoother transitions and reduced the risk of succession crises. It was a practical reform, but one that gave Egypt remarkable continuity for generations. Under Amenemhat I, the Middle Kingdom found its footing. The state was centralized, the bureaucracy efficient, and the image of the king once again stood at the heart of Egypt's identity. The lessons of the Old Kingdom's collapse had been learned, and the result was a government built for stability. With Amenemhat II's reforms in place, Egypt entered a period of prosperity under his successors, especially the line of kings named Senusret and Amenemhat. This dynasty would take the foundation he built and expand it into one of the most stable and productive eras in Egyptian history. Senusret I, who ruled alongside his father as co-regent and then on his own, strengthened Egypt's borders and invested heavily in building projects. At Thebes, he added to the great temple of Amun at Karnak, beginning a tradition of expansion that later pharaohs would continue for centuries. He also encouraged art and literature, making the Middle Kingdom not only a time of political order, but also of cultural richness. His successor, Amenemhat III, maintained stability, while Senusret II turned his attention to Egypt's lifeline, the Nile. He began a series of irrigation projects in the Fayum, a vast depression southwest of the river. By digging canals and constructing dikes, he transformed the area into fertile farmland, increasing Egypt's agricultural wealth. This was more than an engineering achievement. It was a sign that the Middle Kingdom rulers were thinking about long-term prosperity, ensuring food security for their people. Senusret III carried Egypt's ambitions even further. Known as a warrior king, he led campaigns into Nubia, pushing Egypt's southern frontier deeper than ever before. To secure these gains, he built a chain of massive fortresses along the Nile, controlling trade routes and deterring rebellions. His image, depicted in statues with stern, lined faces, reflects a king who was not only powerful, but also deeply aware of the weight of rule. So respected was he that Egyptians later worshipped him as a god during his lifetime. Finally, Amenemhat III presided over the height of Middle Kingdom prosperity. He continued large-scale irrigation projects, supported mining and trade, and built ambitious monuments, including the enormous mortuary complex at Hawara, later called the Labyrinth by Greek writers for its endless halls and chambers. His reign was marked by stability, wealth, and innovation, the peak of the dynasty's achievements. Together, the Senusrets and Amenemhats defined the Middle Kingdom as Egypt's classical age. Their policies balanced military strength, economic development, and cultural patronage, creating a model of governance that later dynasties would look back on with admiration. So far, we've looked at the kings and their reforms, but what about the lives of the people who lived under the Middle Kingdom? To understand why this period is remembered as a time of prosperity, we need to look at Egypt's society, its agriculture, and its culture. The backbone of daily life remained the Nile. With irrigation projects in places like the Fayum, farmland expanded and crop yields grew more reliable. Farmers planted wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables, while orchards and vineyards produced fruit and wine. To measure the annual flood and plan taxes, officials used nilometers, stone gauges that tracked water levels. Surpluses from agriculture not only fed the population, but also funded temples, armies, and construction projects. Society was more structured than in the first intermediate period. The pharaoh stood at the top, supported by a bureaucracy of scribes, administrators, and priests. But compared to the Old Kingdom, ordinary Egyptians had more opportunity to express themselves. Tomb art from this period often shows realistic scenes of daily life, hunting, fishing, weaving, or music, suggesting a new interest in the individual beyond the idealized forms of earlier ages. Culturally, the Middle Kingdom was a golden age of literature. Works like the Tale of Sinu told stories of loyalty, exile, and return, while the instructions of Amenemhat offered moral and political lessons. These texts reveal not just royal propaganda, but also personal voices and reflections on human experience. Together, strong agriculture, efficient administration, and a flourishing culture created a sense of stability and pride. For many Egyptians, the Middle Kingdom was not just a return to order. It was the height of civilization itself. But like every golden age, the Middle Kingdom could not last forever. After the long and prosperous reign of Amenemhat III, Egypt began to show signs of weakness. His successor, Amenemhat IV, ruled for only a short time, and when he died without a strong heir, the throne passed to Sobekneferu, one of the few women to rule as pharaoh. Her reign was brief, and with her death, the 12th dynasty came to an end. The kings who followed in the 13th dynasty lacked the authority and vision of their predecessors. Egypt remained united in name, but power at the center was fragile. Local governors began regaining influence, and the bureaucracy, once so efficient, became overextended. The system that had kept the Middle Kingdom strong was slowly unraveling. Meanwhile, pressures were building on Egypt's borders. In the north, increasing numbers of migrants from the Levant settled in the eastern delta. They brought new technologies and ideas, but also new competition for land and resources. In the south, Nubia grew in strength, challenging Egyptian control of trade routes. By the mid-18th century BCE, the old balance was gone. Central power was weak, local leaders acted independently, and foreign groups in the delta were growing stronger. Egypt, once stable and united, was slipping toward another period of division, the Second Intermediate Period. The Middle Kingdom had been Egypt's classical age, but its decline opened the door for outsiders to rise within Egypt itself, reshaping the kingdom's destiny. So as the Middle Kingdom drew to a close, Egypt once again found itself vulnerable. The strong kings who had balanced power, reformed administration, and built prosperity were gone. In their place stood weaker rulers, unable to hold the kingdom together with the same authority. The system that Amenemhat I and his successors had carefully crafted began to fray at the edges. In the eastern delta, foreign settlers, people whom the Egyptians called the Hekau Kasut, or Hyksos, were establishing themselves. At first, they blended into local life, trading and farming alongside Egyptians, but as central power faltered, their influence grew. They would soon rise to dominate Lower Egypt, ruling as kings in their own right. At the same time, Nubian power expanded in the south, pressing against Egypt's borders and challenging its control over valuable trade routes. Egypt was squeezed from both directions, north and south, at the very moment when its pharaohs were least able to resist. The Middle Kingdom had been remembered as Egypt's classical age, an era of balance, prosperity, and order. But that balance was gone, and the stage was set for another era of fragmentation. The Second Intermediate Period was about to begin. Now let's move into a chapter where Egypt faced something it had never experienced before: foreign rulers on its own soil. For centuries, the pharaohs had been seen as the unchallenged masters of the Nile Valley. But after the Middle Kingdom's decline, Egypt grew weaker, and into that weakness stepped outsiders, the Hyksos. Their arrival would not only divide the land, but also change Egypt forever. The decline began quietly. After the long and prosperous reign of Amenemhat III, the 13th dynasty fell into instability. Pharaohs came and went in quick succession, some ruling for only a few years, others for mere months. Without long, stable reigns, Egypt's government could not maintain the same order that had defined the Middle Kingdom. The bureaucracy was stretched thin, and the central court no longer had the authority to check the power of local governors. As central power collapsed, the provinces grew independent once again. Nomarchs, who had once been kept under tight control, resumed acting like rulers in their own right. Meanwhile, Egypt's borders became harder to defend. To the south, Nubia expanded, pushing back against Egyptian influence and threatening trade routes. To the northeast, new waves of migrants were arriving from the Levant. These groups brought their families, their herds, and their own traditions, settling in the fertile eastern delta. At first, they lived alongside Egyptians peacefully. They worked the land, traded goods, and blended into local communities. But over time, their numbers grew, and with Egypt's government too weak to manage the influx, these settlers gained more autonomy. By the late 13th dynasty, Egypt was no longer a unified kingdom in practice. Instead, it was a fractured land. Weak pharaohs in the center, ambitious local rulers in the south, and foreign newcomers establishing themselves in the north. This was the beginning of what historians call the Second Intermediate Period. Unlike the First Intermediate Period, which was mostly a struggle among Egyptians themselves, this era introduced a new factor: outsiders with both the will and the means to seize power. They would soon rise as the Hyksos, and their rule would leave an indelible mark on Egyptian history. So who exactly were the Hyksos, and how did they rise from foreign settlers to kings of Egypt? The word Hyksos comes from the Egyptian phrase Hekau Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. They were Semitic peoples from the Levant, modern-day Syria and Palestine, who migrated into the eastern Nile delta over generations. At first, they were not conquerors. They were traders, herders, and farmers who found opportunity in Egypt's fertile lands. They adopted Egyptian customs, spoke the language, and lived alongside native communities. But as central power collapsed, they filled the vacuum of authority. By the mid-17th century BCE, the Hyksos had established their own stronghold at Avaris, a city in the northeastern delta. From there, they expanded control across Lower Egypt. Instead of overthrowing Egyptian traditions, they blended with them. Hyksos rulers took on pharaonic titles, wore Egyptian regalia, and worshipped local gods, even as they continued to honor deities of their own. Their reign marked the 15th dynasty of Egypt. What set them apart, however, were the technologies they brought with them. The Hyksos introduced the horse and chariot to Egypt, a combination that transformed warfare. They also employed advanced bronze weaponry, the composite bow with greater range and power, and new styles of fortifications. These innovations gave them a clear military edge over the fragmented Egyptian states. For the Egyptians, the Hyksos presence was both unsettling and familiar. Here were rulers who looked like pharaohs, who worshipped Egyptian gods, but who were undeniably foreign. Their adoption of Egyptian culture made them harder to dismiss, yet their foreign origins made them impossible to fully accept. Within a few decades, the Hyksos had moved from being settlers to recognized kings of the north. And while Thebes still held power in the south, Egypt was no longer a single kingdom. It was divided, with the Hyksos firmly entrenched in Lower Egypt, watching over the delta from their capital at Avaris. Now that the Hyksos had secured their hold on the north, Egypt found itself split in two. For the first time in centuries, there were two distinct centers of power: Avaris in the delta under the Hyksos, and Thebes in the south under native Egyptian rulers. This uneasy balance would define the Second Intermediate Period. In the north, the Hyksos ruled Lower Egypt as the 15th dynasty. Their kings adopted pharaonic titles and maintained Egyptian-style courts, but their authority came from foreign strength: chariots, bronze weapons, and fortified cities. They controlled trade routes to the Levant, giving them access to goods and wealth that strengthened their position. From their perspective, they were legitimate rulers of Egypt, heirs to the crown like any pharaoh before them. Meanwhile, Thebes remained the stronghold of Egyptian tradition. Here, a line of rulers we call the 16th and 17th dynasties held sway over Upper Egypt. Their power was smaller, their resources more limited, but their sense of identity was strong. They portrayed themselves as defenders of Ma'at, the order and balance of the land, against the foreign rulers in the delta. The relationship between north and south was complicated. At times, there was trade and coexistence. Records show that goods moved between Avaris and Thebes, but beneath the surface, tension was constant. The Hyksos presence was a reminder of Egypt's vulnerability, while the Thebans positioned themselves as the true heirs of the old Middle Kingdom. The conflict was not yet open war, but the lines were drawn. On one side stood the Hyksos, foreign rulers entrenched in the delta, secure behind their fortifications. On the other stood the Thebans, proud but outmatched, holding to the dream of reunification. It was only a matter of time before words turned to battle. The balance between north and south could not hold forever. In Thebes, the rulers of the 17th dynasty grew restless under Hyksos dominance. They may have traded with Avaris and maintained a fragile peace, but deep down they saw the Hyksos as outsiders, rulers who had no true claim to Egypt. Eventually, that resentment turned into open defiance. The first to take action was Sekenenre Tao, a Theban king whose reign is remembered through both legend and archaeology. According to one story, the Hyksos king Apophis sent him a bizarre message, demanding that he silence a hippopotamus pool near Thebes because the animals were disturbing his sleep all the way in Avaris. The tale is symbolic, but its meaning is clear. It was an insult, a reminder of who claimed to hold power. Sekenenre did not accept it. He raised arms against the Hyksos, beginning a conflict that would last for decades. Sekenenre's campaign was short-lived. His mummy, discovered in the 19th century, bears deep head wounds from battle, evidence that he died violently, perhaps leading his troops against Hyksos forces. His sacrifice, however, lit the spark. His son, Kamose, continued the struggle. Bold and aggressive, Kamose launched raids into the delta and recorded his victories in inscriptions. He boasted of terrifying Avaris, of burning towns, and of striking fear into the Hyksos. His words may have exaggerated his success, but they show how determined the Thebans were to cast themselves as liberators of Egypt. Kamose died young, but the fight did not end. His younger brother Amose would inherit the throne, and with it, the unfinished war. For the Thebans, this was more than politics. It was a holy cause, a battle to restore Maat and drive the foreigners from Egypt once and for all. The task of finally ending Hyksos rule fell to Amose-Thafan, the last of the Theban line that had fought so hard to restore Egypt. Young when he came to the throne, Amos inherited not just a kingdom, but a mission to drive the foreigners from the land. Amos rebuilt Thebes' strength, organizing a professional army that combined traditional Egyptian forces with the very weapons and technologies the Hyksos had once used against them: horse-drawn chariots, bronze weapons, and composite bows. With this new power, he marched north. The key to the campaign was Avaris, the Hyksos capital in the delta. After fierce fighting, Amos captured the city, but he did not stop there. The remaining Hyksos fled east to Sharuhen in southern Palestine, and Amos pursued them relentlessly. After a siege that lasted years, he destroyed the city, ensuring that the Hyksos would never return to Egypt. With this victory, Egypt was unified once again, and a new era began. Ahmose founded the 18th dynasty, the first of the new kingdom, and transformed Egypt into something it had never been before: a military power with imperial ambitions. From this point onward, Egypt would no longer wait for invaders to reach its borders. It would project power beyond them. The fall of the Hyksos was more than a military triumph. It was the turning of a page in history, marking the end of Egypt's vulnerability and the beginning of its greatest age. So with the Hyksos finally defeated, Egypt stood transformed. For more than a century, foreign rulers had controlled the delta, and Egyptians in the south had lived with the humiliation of division. But now, under Amos Bouin, the country was whole again. Thebes was triumphant, and the dream of unity had been restored. Yet this was not the same Egypt that had existed before. The struggle against the Hyksos had taught the Egyptians hard lessons. They had seen how vulnerable their land could be to outsiders, and how dangerous it was to fall behind in technology and warfare. They had also learned to adapt, borrowing the very weapons and tactics of their enemies and turning them into their own strengths. This new mindset would shape the centuries to come. No longer content to remain within its borders, Egypt began to look outward. Its kings raised standing armies, marched into Nubia and the Levant, and built an empire that would dominate the ancient world. The second intermediate period had been a time of division and foreign control. But out of that struggle emerged a stronger, more aggressive Egypt, ready to enter the new kingdom, the most powerful and ambitious age in its history. With the Hyksos finally expelled, Egypt stood stronger than ever before. The long years of division and foreign rule had taught the Egyptians a lasting lesson. Survival required power. No longer would they simply defend their borders and wait for threats to arrive. From this point forward, Egypt would project strength beyond the Nile Valley, building an empire that stretched farther than any pharaoh had dreamed before. This new age, the new kingdom, would become the high point of Egyptian civilization, an era of monumental kings, dazzling wealth, and global influence. The foundations were laid in the early 18th dynasty, beginning with Ahmose I, who unified the land and rebuilt Egypt's strength. But it was under his successors, Thutmose I and Thutmose II, that the idea of Egypt as an empire truly took shape. Thutmose I was not content with merely securing Egypt's borders. Almost immediately, he turned south toward Nubia, a region that had long been both a trading partner and a rival. With well-organized campaigns, he pushed Egypt's frontier deep into Nubian territory, establishing fortresses to secure the gold mines and trade routes that would enrich Egypt for centuries. These victories made clear that the pharaoh was once again the supreme commander, capable of projecting Egyptian power far beyond the traditional limits of the Nile Valley. But Thutmose I did not stop in the south. He also looked north, toward the lands of Syria and the Levant. For the first time in Egyptian history, Egyptian armies marched across the Euphrates River, leaving inscriptions to mark their victories. Though these campaigns were not permanent conquests, they sent a clear message. Egypt had entered the international stage as a great power. Neighbors who once ignored or harassed Egypt now recognized it as a force to be reckoned with. Thutmose II inherited this new legacy, but ruled for only a short time. His reign was brief and relatively quiet compared to his father's, but it maintained the empire that had been built. More importantly, his marriage to Hatshepsut, a powerful royal woman, would set the stage for one of the most remarkable rulers in Egyptian history. After Thutmose II's death, Hatshepsut stepped into the role of regent for the young heir, and soon transformed herself from queen into pharaoh. The new kingdom had begun with military expansion and the bold vision of kings like Thutmose I, but it would soon move into even more extraordinary territory as Egypt's first great female ruler redefined what it meant to be pharaoh. Then came one of the most extraordinary chapters in Egypt's story, the rise of Hatshepsut, the woman who became king. After the death of Thutmose II, the throne passed to his young son, Thutmose III, still too young to rule alone. Hatshepsut, the boy's stepmother and the daughter of a great royal line, was appointed as regent. But soon, she would take a step no Egyptian woman had taken before. She declared herself pharaoh in her own right. Hatshepsut carefully reshaped her image to fit this unprecedented role. In inscriptions and statues, she is often shown wearing the false beard and kilt of a male pharaoh, even as her titles emphasized her legitimacy as a king of Egypt. This was not merely ambition, it was a political masterstroke. By presenting herself as both mother figure and king, she stabilized the throne during a vulnerable period and gave Egypt nearly 2 decades of peace and prosperity. Her reign was marked by vision and achievement. She undertook monumental building projects that reshaped the landscape of Thebes. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, nestled against the cliffs of western Thebes, remains one of the most striking structures of the ancient world, a masterpiece. of symmetry, terraces, and colonnades that celebrated her divine right to rule. She also raised towering obelisks at Karnak, inscriptions carved deep into the stone to declare her greatness. But Hatshepsut's legacy was not only about stone. She revitalized Egypt's wealth through trade, most famously organizing a grand expedition to the mysterious land of Punt. Ships returned laden with incense, gold, ivory, and exotic goods, treasures that enriched the temples and reinforced Egypt's prestige. For nearly 20 years, Egypt thrived under her steady hand, and though later rulers would attempt to erase her name from history, her monuments and achievements still stand, a lasting testament to a woman who defied tradition and became one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. When Hatshepsut's reign came to an end, the throne passed fully to Thutmose III, and with him, Egypt would enter its most aggressive phase of expansion. The age of empire truly began. When Hatshepsut's long reign finally ended, Thutmose III stepped into his full power. For years, he had stood in her shadow, officially king, but with little authority of his own. Now, free to rule as sole pharaoh, he set out to prove himself, not with words, but with war. Thutmose III quickly established himself as Egypt's greatest military leader. Early in his reign, a coalition of Canaanite princes, led by the city of Kadesh, rebelled against Egyptian authority. Rather than wait, Thutmose marched north with his army in a daring campaign. His officers urged him to take a safe, predictable route, but the young pharaoh chose the narrow mountain pass of Aruna, a risky gamble that allowed him to surprise the enemy. The result was the Battle of Megiddo, one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. Thutmose's strategy forced the enemy into retreat, and the siege of Megiddo ended in total Egyptian victory. This was only the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, Thutmose III led no fewer than 17 military campaigns. He pushed Egypt's borders farther than they had ever reached, extending control deep into Nubia in the south and as far as the Euphrates River in the north. Tribute poured into Egypt: gold, exotic animals, foreign captives, and goods from every corner of the Near East. For the first time, Egypt was not just a kingdom along the Nile, it was an empire. But Thutmose III was more than a general. He was also a builder and a statesman. At Karnak, he added new halls and shrines to honor Amun, the god who had guided his victories. His inscriptions record not only the spoils of war, but also his devotion to the divine order of Ma'at, portraying him as both conqueror and protector of Egypt. Later generations remembered him as the Napoleon of Egypt, a ruler whose brilliance on the battlefield reshaped the political map of the ancient world. Under his reign, Egypt reached the height of its power, commanding respect from allies and fear from rivals. And yet, even after decades of warfare, Egypt was not exhausted. With the empire secured, the stage was set for a different kind of ruler, one who would bring peace, prosperity, and cultural brilliance: Amenhotep III. After the relentless campaigns of Thutmose III, Egypt entered an age of peace and prosperity under Amenhotep III. His reign, stretching nearly 4 decades, is often remembered as the golden age of the New Kingdom, a time when wealth, culture, and diplomacy flourished on a scale unmatched. Before, unlike his predecessors, Amenhotep III did not define himself by conquest. By his time, Egypt's empire stretched securely from Nubia in the south to the edges of Syria in the north. Instead of constant campaigning, he used diplomacy and wealth to maintain Egypt's dominance. He married foreign princesses from Babylon, Mitanni, and other great powers, weaving alliances that kept Egypt's borders secure without bloodshed. The tribute from these lands flowed steadily into Egypt, filling its temples with gold and its palaces with luxuries. His reign became a showcase of monumental building, At Thebes, he built the magnificent Luxor temple and expanded Karnak into a vast religious center. His mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile was once one of the largest ever constructed, guarded by two colossal statues, the Colossi of Memnon, that still stand today. These projects were not just displays of grandeur, they were statements that Egypt was at the height of its glory. Amenhotep III also presided over a flourishing of art and literature. Sculptors perfected a refined, elegant style, while writers composed hymns and texts that celebrated the divine power of the king. His court was filled with opulence, and his image was carefully crafted as the living embodiment of the sun god on earth. But beneath this glittering surface, there were signs of tension. The priests of Amun, enriched by centuries of temple donations, were becoming immensely powerful enough to rival the throne itself. To counterbalance them, Amenhotep began to elevate the worship of a lesser god, Aten, the sun disk. Though subtle during his reign, this shift would explode dramatically under his son and successor. For now, however, Egypt basked in its golden age. Under Amenhotep III, the empire was secure, the treasury overflowing, and Egyptian culture at its zenith. It seemed as though nothing could disturb the order of the two lands. Then came a ruler who shattered tradition like no other, Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten. When he inherited the throne after Amenhotep III, Egypt was rich, stable, and powerful. But instead of continuing his father's legacy, Akhenaten chose a different path, one that would shake Egypt's foundations, a religious revolution. In the early years of his reign, he announced his devotion to Aten, the visible disk of the sun. Unlike Amun, whose temples dominated Egypt, Aten was portrayed as universal, shining equally on all lands and peoples. By his 5th year, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and declared Aten the supreme, and perhaps the only god of Egypt. He closed the temples of Amun, stripped the priesthood of power, and redirected resources to the new cult of Aten. To symbolize this new order, he abandoned Thebes and built an entirely new capital at Amarna, a city dedicated solely to Aten's worship. Here, art and architecture broke from centuries of tradition. Statues showed the royal family with elongated heads and delicate bodies in intimate, almost human scenes, far removed from the rigid formality of earlier ages. Akhenaten presented himself not just as king, but as the sole intermediary between Aten and the people. Daily life, from temple rituals to royal ceremonies, revolved around this new theology. For a brief time, Egypt seemed transformed into something entirely different, a kingdom under a single god. But his revolution came at a cost. The closure of temples disrupted religious life for ordinary Egyptians, and the dismissal of Amun's priests created powerful enemies. Abroad, Egypt's influence weakened. Letters from vassal states in Syria and Palestine begged for aid against rival powers, but Akhenaten's attention was fixed on his new city and his god. When Akhenaten died, the experiment collapsed. His successors would erase his name, abandon Amarna, and restore the old gods. Yet his bold attempt at monotheism remains one of the most fascinating episodes in Egypt's history. A moment when one pharaoh dared to rewrite the divine order itself. After the upheaval of Akhenaten's revolution, Egypt longed for stability. That restoration came during the reign of a boy king whose name would echo across history, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun ascended the throne around the age of 9, guided by powerful advisors, including the vizier Ay and the general Horemheb. Though young, His reign marked the official undoing of Akhenaten's reforms. He changed his name from Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling a clear return to the traditional gods. Temples of Amun were reopened, priests regained their influence, and the capital shifted back to Thebes. For ordinary Egyptians, this restoration meant a return to the religious order they had known for centuries. Politically, Tutankhamun's reign was short and relatively quiet. Egypt worked to rebuild its authority abroad after years of neglect during Akhenaten's rule. Domestically, construction resumed on temples and monuments, a sign that Egypt was finding its footing again. Yet the boy king's life ended suddenly, around the age of 18, leaving no heir to continue his line. For centuries, Tutankhamun was a minor figure in Egypt's history, remembered more as a link between the Amarna period and the powerful rulers who followed. But in 1922, when Howard Carter uncovered his nearly intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings, Tutankhamun became immortal. His golden mask and treasures captured the world's imagination, making him the most famous pharaoh of them all. Then came the most celebrated ruler of them all, Ramesses II, remembered simply as Ramesses the Great. His reign, stretching an astonishing 67 years, became the very symbol of Egypt's power, ambition, and endurance. To later generations, he was the model of the warrior pharaoh and the ultimate builder king. Early in his reign, Ramesses faced Egypt's most formidable rival, the Hittite Empire of Anatolia. The two powers clashed in 1274 BCE at the famous Battle of Kadesh in Syria. Ramesses led his chariots boldly into the field, but the Hittites had laid an ambush, nearly crushing the Egyptian army. In the chaos, Ramesses is said to have fought with divine strength, rallying his troops and personally driving back the enemy. Though the battle ended in stalemate, Ramesses claimed it as a grand victory, inscribing his heroic version of events on temples across Egypt. What mattered more than the outcome was the image, Ramesses as the invincible defender of Egypt. Years later, he concluded a peace treaty with the Hittites, the first known in recorded history. This alliance turned former enemies into allies, cemented through diplomacy and even royal marriages. It was a masterstroke of statecraft that gave Egypt decades of stability. But Ramesses' true legacy lies in stone. No other pharaoh built on such a scale. He raised the vast Ramesseum, his mortuary temple at Thebes, a monument to his grandeur. He constructed a new capital, Pi Ramesses, filled with palaces, temples, and colossal statues. Most famous of all, he carved the rock-cut temples of Abu Simbel in Nubia, their towering seated statues of the king still gazing across the desert today. Ramesses cultivated his image with relentless energy. Everywhere in Egypt, his name and likeness appeared, overshadowing even the memory of earlier kings. He fathered more than 100 children, filling the royal court with his descendants. By the time of his death in his 90s, he had outlived many of his heirs, leaving behind a legacy so vast that later generations could scarcely tell where history ended and legend began. For Egyptians, Ramesses II was the great ancestor, the living god whose shadow stretched across the centuries. Under his reign, Egypt reached its final peak of power and glory. But even the mightiest empires must face decline, and after his time, Egypt's fortunes began to fade. After the long and glorious reign of Ramesses II, Egypt struggled to maintain its strength. The throne passed through his many sons and grandsons, until, eventually, Ramesses III rose to power in the 20th dynasty. He would become the last of Egypt's great warrior pharaohs, a king who fought with courage, but presided over a kingdom slowly unraveling. Ramesses III's reign was marked by near-constant defense. Most famously, he faced the threat of the Sea Peoples, mysterious groups who stormed across the eastern Mediterranean around 1177 BCE, toppling kingdoms and devastating trade routes. They sailed against Egypt with powerful fleets and armies, threatening to bring the same destruction to the Nile Valley. Rameses prepared carefully. Rather than meet them in open battle, he set ambushes along the delta's waterways. Egyptian archers rained arrows from the riverbanks, while the navy attacked from behind. The invaders were crushed, and Egypt stood as one of the few civilizations to survive the Sea People's onslaught. On temple walls at Medinet Habu, Rameses had the victory carved in vivid detail, immortalizing himself as Egypt's savior. But the cost of survival was heavy. The wars drained Egypt's treasury, straining its economy. Workers in the royal necropolis at Deir el-Medina went unpaid, sparking the first recorded labor strike in history. Corruption spread, and a conspiracy within the royal harem even plotted to assassinate the king. Rameses III was gravely injured in the attempt and likely died from his wounds. After his death, the weakness of Egypt became undeniable. Successive pharaohs who bore his name lacked his strength. Meanwhile, the priests of Amun in Thebes grew wealthier and more powerful, rivaling and even overshadowing the authority of the king. The new kingdom, once the empire of empires, was fading into decline. The age of monumental pharaohs had ended. What followed was fragmentation, division, and the long slide into the third intermediate period. So the new kingdom, Egypt's greatest age, drew to a close. From the victories of Thutmose and the bold reign of Hatshepsut to the empire of Thutmose III and the golden splendor of Amenhotep III, it had been an era of unmatched power. Akhenaten's revolution had tested Egypt's traditions. Tutankhamun's restoration had healed them, and Rameses II had immortalized himself as the great ancestor. Even in its twilight, under Rameses III, Egypt still stood against enemies who toppled other kingdoms. Yet beneath the monuments and victories, cracks had formed. Endless building projects strained the treasury, wars exhausted the state, and long reigns left succession uncertain. More dangerous still, the priests of Amun in Thebes accumulated immense wealth and authority, steadily eclipsing the pharaoh's role. By the end of the 20th dynasty, kings ruled in name, while real power shifted to the temple. The new kingdom had given the world its most enduring images of Egypt. Colossal statues, golden treasures, and the empire's reach across the ancient world. But now, that brilliance was dimming. Egypt would not vanish, but it would never again command the same glory. Ahead lay a time of division and foreign influence, the third intermediate period. With the decline of the new kingdom, Egypt entered a new era, one far different from the glory of empire. The great warrior pharaohs were gone, and the power that had once reached deep into Asia and Nubia now faltered. Instead of a single commanding ruler, Egypt fractured into competing centers of authority. What followed is known as the Third Intermediate Period, an age of division, shifting dynasties, and foreign influence. The first signs of this fragmentation appeared with the rise of the 21st dynasty. The royal court moved north to the city of Tanis in the Nile Delta. Here, kings like Smendes claimed the throne and ruled Lower Egypt, but their authority was limited. They commanded the north and held the title of pharaoh, yet they lacked the resources and military strength of their New Kingdom predecessors. Meanwhile, in the south, Thebes emerged as a rival power. It was not led by kings, but by priests, specifically the powerful priesthood of Amun. Over the centuries, the cult of Amun had grown rich from temple donations and land holdings. By the 21st dynasty, the high priests of Amun wielded influence, equal to that of the pharaoh. They controlled Upper Egypt, managed temple estates, and even held military authority. Thus, Egypt was effectively split in two. In the north, the Tanite kings presided over a weakened court, more concerned with local administration than grand conquests. In the south, Theban priests ruled in the name of the gods, maintaining the rituals and traditions that had once bound Egypt together. There was no open civil war between them, but neither side truly commanded the whole country. This division marked a sharp contrast to the unity of the new kingdom, where once a single pharaoh had stood as the undisputed master of both Upper and Lower Egypt. Now the land was divided between crown and temple, secular and religious authority. Egypt continued to function, but its strength was hollow, its unity only symbolic. It was within this fractured landscape that new forces began to rise, outsiders who had once been servants and settlers, but who would soon carve their place into Egypt's history. These were the Libyans, and their rise would reshape the next stage of the Third Intermediate Period. As Egypt's royal authority weakened, a new power stepped into the vacuum: the Libyans. For generations, Libyan tribes had lived along Egypt's western frontier, sometimes raiding, sometimes serving as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. By the late New Kingdom, many Libyans had settled permanently in the delta, gradually integrating into Egyptian society while still maintaining their own clan-based structures. Over time, their leaders grew wealthy and influential, and when central authority collapsed, they were well positioned to seize power. This shift became clear in the 22nd dynasty, founded by Shoshenq around 943 BCE. Shoshenq was of Libyan descent, but by his reign, his family had fully embraced Egyptian kingship. He took the throne at Tanis and presented himself as pharaoh in the traditional sense, complete with all the rituals and regalia of the office. Yet his rise reflected the new reality. Egypt's rulers were no longer drawn from an unbroken native line, but from military and foreign elites who had embedded themselves within the state. Shoshenq the Fine worked to stabilize Egypt. He reformed the priesthood, curbing the unchecked power of the Amun clergy by appointing his own relatives to high positions. He also revived Egypt's ambitions abroad, launching campaigns into Canaan and the Levant. These expeditions are mentioned not only in Egyptian records, but also in the Bible, where Shoshenq appears as Shishak, the king who attacked Jerusalem. For a brief time, his reign restored some of Egypt's old prestige and reminded its neighbors of the pharaoh's strength. But the revival was short-lived. After Shoshenq's death, Egypt slid back into division. Later, Libyan kings could not maintain the same authority, and rival claimants arose in different cities. By the 23rd dynasty, Egypt was once again fragmented, with multiple rulers claiming power simultaneously. What Shoshenq had achieved through reform and war quickly unraveled, leaving the country vulnerable once more. Even so, the Libyan dynasties left their mark. They demonstrated how far Egypt had changed. No longer the empire of the new kingdom, it was now a land where outsiders could claim the throne and where power shifted constantly between crown, priesthood, and local rulers. The promise of stability under Shoshenq faded quickly. After his death, Egypt once again splintered into competing powers. The 23rd dynasty saw multiple kings ruling at the same time, often in different regions, each claiming legitimacy, but none strong enough to unify the land. Some ruled from Tanis, others from Memphis or Heracleopolis, while Thebes remained under the sway of the Amun priesthood. This overlapping authority created confusion and weakened the state. Local rulers, or nomarchs, held real power in their territories, often ignoring the claims of distant pharaohs. In some periods, as many as 4 or 5 kings reigned simultaneously, their spheres of influence reduced to little more than regional strongholds. Egypt was still rich in culture and tradition, but it lacked the central authority that had once defined it. The priesthood of Amun continued to expand its influence, particularly in Thebes. Priests controlled land, wealth, and religious legitimacy, sometimes acting more like monarchs than servants of the gods. In the north, Libyan rulers maintained their dynasties, but their authority was shallow. Each generation brought new divisions, and the once great kingdom of the pharaohs became a patchwork of shifting allegiances. While Egypt weakened, the wider world was changing. To the northeast, Assyria was rising as a formidable military empire, expanding across Mesopotamia and pressing into the Levant. Egypt, fractured and divided, could no longer project strength beyond its borders. Instead, it turned inward, struggling to balance the competing powers of priests, kings, and local chiefs. This deepening fragmentation left Egypt vulnerable, and as one power declined, another prepared to rise in the south. From Nubia, the kingdom of Kush was growing in strength, ready to claim Egypt's legacy as its own. While Egypt fractured internally, strength was gathering beyond its southern border. In Nubia, the kingdom of Kush was flourishing, its capital at Napata becoming a center of wealth and culture. For centuries, Nubia had been influenced by Egypt, adopting its gods, hieroglyphs, and even burial traditions. But now the roles were reversing. The Nubians were not merely imitators, they were building a kingdom strong enough to rival Egypt itself. Kashta, the Kushite king, saw opportunity in Egypt's weakness. Expanding northward, he extended Kushite control into Upper Egypt and placed his daughter as God's wife of Amun at Thebes, securing religious as well as political authority. This was more than conquest. It was a claim to legitimacy, binding the Kushite dynasty to the sacred traditions of Egypt. His successor, Pia, also known as Pianki, went further. Around 730 BCE, he launched a full campaign into Egypt. Marching north, he subdued local rulers one by one. At Memphis, he accepted the surrender of Delta princes who acknowledged him as pharaoh. Pia recorded his victory on a monumental stela, describing how he had restored order to a land corrupted by division. In his inscriptions, he presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the true heir of Egypt, chosen by the gods to reunite the two lands. This marked the beginning of Egypt's 25th dynasty, often called the Nubian or Kushite dynasty. For a brief time, Egypt was unified once again, its kings ruling from Napata but presenting themselves in full pharaonic tradition. Temples were restored, monuments built, and the grandeur of Egypt seemed renewed. Yet Egypt's new unity would not last. Even as the Nubians restored ancient traditions, a greater empire loomed on the horizon, Assyria, whose armies were advancing westward with unstoppable force. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Assyria had become the dominant power of the Near East. Its kings commanded vast armies, armed with iron weapons and trained in siege warfare. From their heartland in Mesopotamia, they expanded relentlessly, conquering Babylon, Syria, and the Levant. Inevitably, their ambitions turned toward Egypt. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty faced this rising threat. They had restored unity, but Egypt's resources were no match for Assyria's military machine. Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, invaded Egypt in 671 BCE, marching into the Delta and capturing Memphis. Though his conquest was temporary, it revealed how vulnerable Egypt had become. A few years later, under Ashurbanipal, Assyria returned with even greater force. This time, Thebes itself was captured and plundered. Temples were looted, treasures carried away, and Egypt's aura of invincibility was shattered. Though the Nubian dynasty continued to rule in the south for a time, Assyria's dominance in the north made clear that Egypt was no longer the master of its own destiny. The once mighty kingdom that had built pyramids and ruled an empire was now caught between foreign powers. First the Libyans, then the Nubians, and finally the Assyrians dictated its fate. Egypt's independence was slipping away, piece by piece, as greater empires rose around it. The third intermediate period was an age of fragmentation and shifting. Powers From the divided rule of Tanis and Thebes, to the rise of Libyan dynasties, to the resurgence under Nubian kings, Egypt struggled to hold on to its ancient identity. Each new dynasty promised revival, yet each was limited by the fractured state of the country and the growing strength of foreign empires. Even so, Egyptian culture endured. The Nubians, far from erasing it, embraced it fully, reviving traditional art, temples and rituals. The image of the pharaoh, the authority of the gods, and the dream of a unified two lands lived on, even as Egypt's political independence faded. But the truth was clear. The age of pharaohs commanding great empires had passed. Egypt was now a prize to be contested by outsiders, its wealth and prestige drawing the attention of powers far stronger than itself. Ahead lay centuries of foreign rule by Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks. As Egypt became part of a wider world, it could no longer dominate. The Third Intermediate Period had closed the chapter of empire. What followed was the long twilight of ancient Egypt. After the turbulence of the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt entered what historians call the Late Period, the final centuries of pharaonic independence. It was an age defined by resilience and revival, but also by conquest and foreign domination. Time and again, native rulers rose to restore Egypt's pride, only to be swept aside by stronger empires beyond the Nile Valley. The monuments still stood, the temples still thrived, and the rituals of the gods continued. Yet Egypt's power on the world stage was no longer what it had been. The Late Period was, in many ways, a story of survival. That survival was first tested in 525 BCE, when Egypt faced a new and formidable enemy, Persia. The Achaemenid Empire under Cambyses II had already conquered much of the Near East, stretching from Anatolia to Babylon. Now its gaze turned westward to the Nile. At Pelusium, near the eastern delta, the Persian army clashed with Egypt's forces under Pharaoh Psammetichus III, the last king of the 26th dynasty. The Egyptians fought bravely, but the sheer scale and discipline of the Persian forces proved overwhelming. Egypt was defeated, and for the first time in its long history, it became a province, a satrapy of a foreign empire. Accounts from Herodotus paint Cambyses as a harsh ruler, mocking Egyptian traditions and even desecrating sacred animals. Modern historians debate how much of this is truth and how much is Greek storytelling, but the memory of Cambyses as a tyrant lingered. Egypt, long accustomed to revering its pharaohs as gods, now bowed to a distant king who neither lived among them nor honored their customs. Yet Persia was not uniform in its treatment of Egypt. Cambyses' successors, especially Darius I, adopted a more conciliatory approach. Darius funded the restoration of temples, supported the priesthood, and even commissioned construction projects in the Egyptian style. Inscriptions survive of him presenting himself as a traditional pharaoh, honoring the gods of Egypt and claiming legitimacy as their chosen ruler. Still, the reality remained. Egypt was no longer free. The wealth of the Nile now flowed eastward, feeding the Persian court at Persepolis. Priests and scribes continued their work, but they did so under foreign masters. For the Egyptian people, the ancient balance had shifted. Their kings no longer stood at the center of the world. They were subjects of an empire that spanned continents. This first Persian domination, the 27th dynasty, marked a turning point. Egypt had survived foreign invasions before, but never had it been so thoroughly absorbed into another power. And though moments of independence would return, the precedent was set. The age of an unchallenged Egyptian pharaoh was over. But Egypt was not finished yet. In time, native dynasties would rise again, seeking to reclaim the throne and revive the old glories of the Nile. Though Persia's grip on Egypt was strong, it was never unbreakable. Across the late period, there were moments when native rulers reclaimed independence, breathing new life into the old kingdom. The most remarkable of these revivals began in the city of Sais in the Western Delta, giving rise to what historians call the Site dynasty. Psamtik I, founder of the 26th dynasty, emerged in the wake of Assyrian influence and Persian expansion. With careful diplomacy and shrewd alliances, he secured independence around 664 BCE. Psamtik did not rely solely on Egyptian soldiers. He hired Greek mercenaries and established foreign colonies to strengthen Egypt's military base. For the first time, Egypt entered a new kind of international world, one where Greek traders and warriors became part of the kingdom's defense and economy. His reign stabilized the land, restored central authority, and set the tone for a century of revival. His successor, Necho Sun, continued these reforms and expanded Egypt's horizons. Necho is remembered for ambitious building projects, including attempts to link the Nile to the Red Sea with a great canal, a forerunner to the modern Suez Canal. Ancient accounts even suggest that under his orders, Phoenician sailors may have circumnavigated Africa, a feat that, if true, would have been centuries ahead of its time. Militarily, Necho sought to assert Egypt's influence in the Levant, clashing with Babylonian power. Though ultimately defeated, his reign shows how Egypt still aspired to empire, even in this late age. Later kings of the Site dynasty, like Apries and Amasis II, presided over a flourishing Egypt. Amasis in particular forged strong ties with the Greeks, granting them a trading post at Naucratis, which became a hub of cultural and economic exchange. Temples were restored, statues commissioned, and Egypt enjoyed prosperity. Foreign mercenaries defended its borders, while Egyptian art and tradition thrived once again. It was a moment when the old kingdom seemed reborn, not as the global empire of the new kingdom, but as a wealthy, confident state that could still command respect. The final native dynasty, the 30th, under Nectanebo-Farnon II, carried this revival forward. They poured resources into temples and monuments, trying to restore Egypt's ancient prestige. Nectanebo II, the last native pharaoh, defended the land with determination against Persian invasions. His reign produced some of the last great works of Egyptian temple architecture, showing that even in decline, the cultural spirit of the Nile endured. But Egypt's resources were thin, and the Persian Empire was relentless. Despite Nectanebo's efforts, the Persians returned, overwhelming Egypt once more. The native dream flickered out, and with it ended 3 millennia of uninterrupted Egyptian kingship. The Saite and later dynasties proved that Egypt's resilience was extraordinary, but they also revealed the limits of revival in a world increasingly dominated by vast empires. The last resistance of the native pharaohs could not hold forever. In 343 BCE, Egypt once again fell to the Persians, this time under Artaxerxes III. This marked the beginning of the 31st dynasty, often referred to as the Second Persian period. Unlike earlier rulers who sought to accommodate Egyptian traditions, Artaxerxes entered as a conqueror, determined to tighten control. Persian armies swept into the delta, overwhelming the defenders and capturing Memphis. Nectanebo II, the last native pharaoh of Egypt, fled south into Nubia, leaving the throne vacant. With his departure, the long, unbroken chain of Egyptian-born rulers came to an end. For the first time in over 3,000 years, Egypt no longer had a pharaoh of its own bloodline. The Persian administration was harsher this time. Temples were stripped of wealth, and heavy tributes were imposed on the people. Inscriptions suggest that sacred images and treasures were carried off to Persia, undermining the prestige of Egypt's priesthood. What had once been the proudest civilization of the Nile was now treated as a province, its resources drained to serve a foreign empire. Revolts did occur, fueled by resentment against foreign rule, but none succeeded. Egypt had become too fractured, and Persia too strong. For little more than a decade, the Persians maintained their control, but their grip was tenuous. By the later 4th century BCE, Persia itself faced a new threat, one far greater than Egypt could have mounted on its own. From the north came Alexander of Macedon, whose armies swept through the Persian Empire with astonishing speed. Within a few years, the world order shifted, and Egypt once again found itself caught in the struggle between greater powers. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt during his campaign against Persia. To the Egyptians, weary of Persian domination, he was not an invader but a liberator. The Persian satraps surrendered without resistance, and Alexander was welcomed in triumph. At Memphis, he was crowned as pharaoh, presented not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful king chosen by the gods. Eager to secure his legitimacy, Alexander traveled to the Siwa oasis, deep in the western desert, where the oracle of Amun declared him the son of the god. This moment cemented his place within the sacred tradition of Egyptian kingship, blending Macedonian conquest with pharaonic authority. But Alexander's vision reached beyond Egypt. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city, Alexandria. Designed as a hub of trade, culture, and learning, it would become one of the most important cities of the ancient world, linking Egypt to the wider Hellenistic world. Alexander's stay in Egypt was brief. He soon marched east to pursue the Persians. Yet his presence marked the end of Egypt's ancient independence. The pharaohs of native blood were gone forever. In their place would come the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that blended Macedonian rule with Egyptian traditions, carrying the legacy of the Nile into a new age. The late period was Egypt's last stand as a pharaonic kingdom. It was a time of resilience, when native dynasties like the Site kings restored order and wealth, and when great rulers such as Necho and Nectanebo dreamed of reviving past glories. But it was also a time of relentless foreign pressure, as Persians and later Macedonians proved too powerful to resist. Egypt's story in these centuries is not one of total collapse, but of adaptation. Even under Persian domination, temples were rebuilt, traditions continued, and the image of the pharaoh remained sacred. When Alexander arrived, he embraced these customs, showing how deeply Egyptian culture could absorb and outlast its conquerors. By the end of the late period, Egypt no longer commanded empires abroad. Instead, it became part of a wider world shaped by foreign powers. Yet the essence of Egypt, its gods, its monuments, its timeless Nile, endured, shaping the identities of those who ruled it. With Alexander's conquest, the ancient world of the pharaohs came to an end, and the Hellenistic age began. Egypt would remain a land of wonders, but its destiny would now be written as part of a much larger stage. With Alexander's conquest, the long reign of the pharaohs came to an end. Egypt entered a new age, first under the Ptolemies and later the Romans, its fate tied to empires that rose far beyond the Nile Valley. Yet even as the crowns changed hands, the essence of Egypt did not disappear. The temples, tombs, and pyramids still stood. The language and rituals of the gods lingered, and the memory of a civilization that had flourished for 3,000 years continued to echo through history. To say that ancient Egypt ended is only partly true. Politically, yes, the line of native rulers was broken forever. But culturally, Egypt remained one of the strongest threads woven into the fabric of human history. Even when forgotten, buried beneath sand or absorbed into foreign empires, Egypt's story endured, waiting to be rediscovered. The pharaohs left a legacy unlike any other. Their monuments rose on a scale so vast that even today they defy imagination. The pyramids of Giza, The towering temples of Karnak and Luxor, the colossal statues of Ramesses II, the painted tombs of the Valley of the Kings, all remain as witnesses to a civilization that measured its time not in years, but in millennia. But the inheritance of Egypt was more than stone. The Egyptians developed one of the world's earliest writing systems, recording prayers, literature, laws, and accounts of daily life. Their art and architecture set standards of precision and beauty that influenced generations long after their time. Their knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine spread beyond their borders, carried into the Mediterranean world. Religion, too, proved enduring. The gods of Egypt, Isis, Osiris, Horus, Amun, were later adopted and reinterpreted by Greeks and Romans. The cult of Isis, in particular, spread across the Mediterranean, worshipped in Rome centuries after the fall of the New Kingdom. Even as empires rose and fell, Egypt's symbols of rebirth and eternity retained their power. In every age that followed, from antiquity to the modern era, Egypt remained a touchstone of wonder. For centuries after the Roman and Byzantine eras, much of Egypt's ancient past faded from memory. Temples fell silent, hieroglyphs became unreadable, and the grandeur of the pharaohs seemed little more than legend. Travelers saw the pyramids and colossal statues, but could not decipher their meaning. Egypt became, to outsiders, a land of mystery. That mystery began to lift in 1799 when French soldiers during Napoleon's campaign uncovered the Rosetta Stone near the town of Rashid. Inscribed with the same text in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs, it offered the key to unlocking a forgotten language. 2 decades later, Jean-François Champollion deciphered the script, giving voice to the ancient world once more. The 19th and 20th centuries became an age of rediscovery. Archaeologists explored the Nile Valley, uncovering temples, statues, and tombs that had been hidden for millennia. The greatest moment came in 1922, when Howard Carter entered the tomb of Tutankhamun, nearly intact, filled with treasures, and crowned by the golden mask that became an icon of Egypt itself. Through these discoveries, the silence of centuries was broken, and the pharaohs once again spoke to the world. Today, ancient Egypt is both history and living heritage. Its monuments draw millions of visitors each year, from the pyramids at Giza to the temples of Abu Simbel. The country's museums hold treasures that continue to inspire awe, while excavations still reveal new discoveries, reminding us that Egypt's story is far from fully told. For Egyptians themselves, the legacy is not just ancient, but present. Festivals echo the rhythms of the Nile. The Coptic Church preserves fragments of the old language in its prayers. Traditional foods, crafts, and customs carry faint traces of practices that go back thousands of years. The Nile, as Herodotus once wrote, remains Egypt's lifeline, as essential today as it was in the age of the pharaohs. Globally, Egypt lives on as a symbol of mystery and endurance. It appears in literature, art, film, and popular culture, shaping imaginations across the world. From Cleopatra's dramatized romances to Hollywood's fascination with pyramids and mummies, the ancient land of the Nile continues to cast its spell. No civilization has been so thoroughly absorbed into the global consciousness, both as history and as myth. Egypt remains a bridge between the ancient and the modern, a reminder of humanity's capacity to build, to endure, and to dream. The story of ancient Egypt is not simply the tale of a kingdom that rose and fell. It is the story of a civilization that endured for longer than any other in human history, that reinvented itself time and again, and that left a legacy still visible today. From the first farmers on the banks of the Nile to the great pharaohs of empire, from foreign conquests to rediscovery in modern times, Egypt's journey has been one of resilience. Even when conquered, it was never erased. The Persians, Greeks, and Romans who ruled Egypt all found themselves drawn into its traditions, compelled to honor its gods and adopt its symbols. And when its language and rituals were finally forgotten, they returned centuries later through archaeology, scholarship, and the fascination of the world. Empires rise and fall, but Egypt remains, eternal as the Nile itself. The Nile itself.